the billionaire who swore off fatherhood until a 9-month-old's first word changed everything. Alexander Chun had constructed his life with the same precision he applied to building his tech empire. At 32, he was worth over $3 billion, lived in a penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline of Seattle, and had cultivated a reputation for being brilliant, driven, and utterly indifferent to anything that didn't serve his ambitions. But there was one thing Alexander was known for above all else: his absolute aversion to children. "I don't do kids," he'd say flatly whenever the topic arose at business dinners or family gatherings. "They're unpredictable, illogical, and a liability I have no interest in acquiring." His older sister, Michelle, would roll her eyes at these pronouncements. "You sound like you're talking about a bad investment, Alex. They're human beings." "Exactly," he'd reply coolly. "Human beings who cry, break things, and demand attention at all hours. I'll pass." It wasn't cruelty that motivated Alexander's stance, at least he didn't think so. It was self-preservation. His own childhood had been a masterclass in emotional unavailability. His father, a ruthless corporate lawyer, had treated parenting like a quarterly review: cold, transactional, and focused solely on measurable achievements. His mother had been so consumed by maintaining their family's social standing that Alexander and his sister had essentially raised themselves with the help of an ever-rotating staff of nannies who never stayed long enough to form attachments. By the time Alexander turned 18, he'd internalized a simple truth: emotions were weaknesses, attachments were vulnerabilities, and children were the ultimate gamble he refused to take. He'd watched his friends from college settle down, have babies, and transform into zombified versions of themselves, sleep-deprived, broke, and utterly consumed by tiny tyrants who couldn't even use a toilet properly. No, thank you. Instead, Alexander had poured everything into Chun Technologies. He'd built it from a dorm room startup into a multinational corporation specializing in AI-driven solutions for urban infrastructure. He worked 16-hour days, traveled constantly, and came home to blissful silence in his minimalist penthouse where everything had its place and nothing demanded his attention except his stock portfolio. His previous housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had understood this perfectly. She'd been with him for 5 years. A stern British woman in her 60s who ran his household with military efficiency and, blessedly, had no children of her own to bring into his carefully controlled environment. When she'd announced her retirement to move back to London, Alexander had been genuinely disappointed. "I'll find you someone equally professional," his executive assistant, James, had assured him. "Someone who understands your requirements." Those requirements were extensive: discretion, excellence, and absolutely no personal drama bleeding into his space. Enter Elena Martinez. She'd appeared at his door on a gray Monday morning in March, dressed in simple black pants and a white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. At 28, she had warm brown eyes that held both determination and something else Alexander couldn't quite place: a shadow of recent hardship, perhaps. "Mr. Chun, I'm Elena Martinez. I'm here for the housekeeper position," she'd said, her voice steady despite the nervous way she clutched her portfolio of references. The interview had been brief and businesslike. Her credentials were impeccable: 5 years of experience with high-net-worth families, glowing references, certifications in everything from gourmet cooking to managing smart home systems. She was overqualified, if anything, which made Alexander wonder why she was interested in the position. "I can start immediately," Elena had said when he'd asked about her availability. "I need the work, Mr. Chun. I'll be honest with you, I'm a single mother. My daughter is 9 months old. But I can assure you that will never interfere with my duties. I have reliable childcare arranged, and I'm available whenever you need me." Alexander had stiffened at the mention of a child. Warning bells had sounded in his head. This was exactly the kind of complication he wanted to avoid. But then Elena had added, "I understand if that's a deal breaker. I just believe in being upfront. I promise you'll never even know she exists." I keep my personal life completely separate from my work." There was something in her eyes, a quiet desperation mixed with fierce pride, that made Alexander pause. He recognized that look. It was the same expression he'd seen in his own mirror years ago when he'd been fighting to get his first round of funding, when he'd been one rejection away from losing everything. Against his better judgment, he'd hired her. That had been 6 weeks ago, and to Elena's credit, she'd been true to her word. She arrived each morning at 7, worked with quiet efficiency, and left promptly at 6. The penthouse had never been more perfectly maintained. She anticipated his needs before he voiced them, kept the kitchen stocked with his preferences, and managed to be simultaneously invisible and indispensable. Alexander had almost forgotten about the child altogether. Until the day everything changed. It started as just another Thursday. Alexander had been in his home office since 5 in the morning, preparing for a crucial board meeting scheduled for the following week. He'd been so absorbed in financial projections that he hadn't noticed when Elena arrived, hadn't heard her moving through the apartment with her usual quiet competence. Around 9, he'd emerged from his office, desperate for more coffee, and had been surprised to hear Elena's voice coming from the kitchen, not alone, but speaking in a soft, soothing tone that he'd never heard her use before. "Show me more, it's okay. Mama's here. I'm so sorry, baby. I know. Alexander had frozen in the hallway, suddenly aware that something was very wrong. Elena sounded on the verge of tears herself. He'd approached the kitchen doorway and stopped short at the scene before him. Elena was sitting at his kitchen island, and in her arms was a baby, her daughter, obviously. The child was flushed and crying, not the screaming wail of a tantrum but the miserable, exhausted whimper of a sick infant. Elena's eyes were red-rimmed, and she was gently rocking the baby while pressing a cool cloth to the child's forehead. "Mr. Chen." Elena had jumped to her feet, looking mortified. "I'm so sorry. I know this is completely inappropriate. My sister was supposed to watch Sophia, but she came down with a stomach flu this morning, and the backup sitter fell through, and Sophia has been running a fever since 3 a.m. I called the pediatrician, and they can't see her until this afternoon, and I couldn't leave her alone, and I thought I could just keep her quiet in the kitchen while I worked, and you wouldn't even notice, and I'm so sorry." The words had tumbled out in a breathless rush, and Alexander had seen the fear in Elena's eyes, the terror of losing this job she so desperately needed. He should have been angry. He should have calmly reminded her of the boundaries and perhaps given her the day off to deal with her personal situation. But instead, his eyes had fallen on the baby, Sophia, and something unexpected had squeezed in his chest. Alexander had never been this close to an infant before. At least, not one he actually looked at as anything more than a theoretical inconvenience. Sophia was tiny, impossibly so, with dark curls plastered to her feverish forehead and wide brown eyes that seemed too large for her face. She wasn't screaming anymore, but she was making these small, heartbreaking whimpering sounds that seemed designed by evolution to bypass all human defenses. It was working. "How high is her fever?" Alexander had heard himself ask, his voice coming out softer than intended. Elena had looked startled by the question. "It was 101.2 this morning. I gave her infant acetaminophen, but she won't take her bottle, and I think she's getting dehydrated," and her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Chen. I'll leave right now. I understand if you need to terminate my employment. I just need to get Sophia to the doctor." Alexander had stood there, watching this young woman trying to hold herself together while clearly running on no sleep and maximum stress, holding a sick baby who was depending entirely on her, and he'd felt something shift inside him. It was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, like a locked door being forced open. "What time is the pediatrician appointment?" he'd asked. 2 o'clock, Elena had whispered. "At the clinic on 5th Avenue. Alexander had checked his watch. It was 9:15. That's almost 5 hours away. That's unacceptable for a baby with a fever. Elena's eyes had filled with tears. "I know, but they said, "I'm calling Dr. Patel," Alexander had interrupted, pulling out his phone. "She's my concierge physician. She makes house calls." "Mr. Chin, I couldn't possibly." "Elena." He'd looked at her directly. "Your daughter is sick. Let me help." 20 minutes later, Dr. Patel had arrived at the penthouse with a medical bag and a warm smile. She'd examined Sophia on Alexander's pristine white sofa, something that would have made him anxious just an hour earlier, but now seemed absurdly unimportant. "She has an ear infection," Dr. Patel had announced after a thorough examination. "Painful but treatable. I'm going to prescribe an antibiotic, and the fever should break within 24 hours. She turned to Elena with professional kindness. "Has she been pulling at her ear?" "Yes," Elena had said, relief flooding her features. "Since yesterday evening. I thought it might be teething." "Common confusion," Dr. Patel had assured her. "The good news is this medication works quickly. She should start feeling better by tonight." After Dr. Patel had left and Elena had gotten the prescription sent to the pharmacy, Alexander had found himself still in the living room, watching Elena try to coax Sophia into drinking from a bottle. The baby kept turning her head away, fussing weakly. "She won't eat when she feels this bad," Elena had murmured, more to herself than to him. "But she needs to stay hydrated." "There's Pedialyte in the pantry," Alexander had said suddenly. Elena had looked at him in surprise. "You have Pedialyte?" He'd shrugged, feeling oddly self-conscious. "My assistant stocks the pantry. There's everything in there." It was true. James maintained the kitchen like a luxury bunker, prepared for any conceivable need. Alexander had never questioned it before. Elena had made up a bottle with the Pedialyte, and after some coaxing, Sophia had taken a few sips. It wasn't much, but it was something. Alexander had watched this small victory and felt a strange sense of relief himself. "Mr. Chin," Elena had said quietly, "I can't thank you enough. For Dr. Patel, for letting us stay, for not firing me on the spot. I promise this will never happen again." "You can't promise that," Alexander had found himself saying. "She's a baby. She's going to get sick. Things are going to happen." Elena had looked at him with such surprise that Alexander had realized how out of character his response was. The old Alexander, the Alexander of 6 weeks ago, would have already been composing the termination agreement in his head. But something about this situation had gotten under his skin. Maybe it was seeing Elena's fierce determination to handle everything alone, to never be a burden, to maintain perfect professionalism even while her world was falling apart. He recognized that kind of isolation. He'd lived it for years. "Take the rest of the day off," he'd said. "Obviously. Stay here if you need to. The guest room is available. You shouldn't be dragging a sick baby on public transportation." "I couldn't possibly." "Elena." He'd used his boardroom voice, the one that ended arguments. "You're staying. I have meetings all afternoon anyway. I won't even be here." That had been a lie. He'd canceled everything and worked from his home office, telling himself it was just because he needed to focus on the investor reports. But every hour, he'd found himself drifting out to check on them. Elena had settled into the guest room with Sophia, and through the half-open door, he'd watched her rock the baby, sing soft Spanish lullabies, press kisses to that fevered forehead. There was something almost holy about it, the way she tended to this tiny person with such complete devotion. It was the kind of love Alexander had never received, had never understood, had convinced himself didn't really exist outside of greeting cards and sentimental movies. By evening, Sophia's fever had started to break, and she'd finally fallen into a deeper sleep in Elena's arms. Alexander had ordered dinner from the Italian restaurant Elena had once mentioned liking. He'd filed away that detail without realizing it, and had insisted she eat something. They'd sat at his kitchen island in strangely comfortable silence, Elena eating with one hand while the other supported sleeping Sophia. Alexander had found himself asking questions. How old had Elena been when she'd had Sophia? Was the father in the picture? How was she managing alone? Elena had answered honestly, perhaps too exhausted to maintain her usual professional boundaries. She'd been 27 when she'd gotten pregnant. The father had been a boyfriend of 2 years who'd seemed committed, until the pregnancy test came back positive. Then he disappeared so completely and thoroughly that Elena had stopped trying to find him. I thought about other options, she'd admitted quietly, not looking at Alexander. I was terrified. I had no family support, no safety net. My parents passed away when I was 19, and I'd been on my own ever since. The idea of doing it all alone. She'd trailed off, looking down at Sophia's sleeping face. But I couldn't. The moment she was born and they put her in my arms, I knew I'd made the right choice. Even when it's impossibly hard. Even when I'm so tired I can barely remember my own name. She's worth everything. Alexander had felt something crack open in his chest, some sealed-off chamber he'd thought would remain closed forever. That night, after Elena and Sophia had finally gone home, Elena had insisted once Sophia's fever broke, Alexander had sat in his silent, perfect penthouse and felt its emptiness for the first time in years. After that Thursday, something fundamental shifted in the dynamics of Alexander's household, though neither he nor Elena acknowledged it directly. Elena continued to arrive each morning with her characteristic punctuality and professionalism, but now Alexander found himself emerging from his office more frequently, timing his coffee breaks to coincide with her presence in the kitchen. He asked about Sophia. How was her ear infection? Was she sleeping better? Had she recovered fully? Elena answered with cautious warmth, clearly uncertain about this new interest from her intensely private employer but grateful for his kindness during their crisis. She's much better, Elena would report. Back to her usual self, trying to pull herself up on everything and getting into trouble. What kind of trouble can a 9-month-old possibly get into? Alexander had asked, genuinely curious. Elena had laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her. You'd be surprised. Yesterday, she somehow managed to pull an entire shelf of books onto herself. Nothing valuable, she'd added quickly, seeing his expression. Just my paperbacks. But she's fearless. Doesn't understand consequences yet. Alexander had found himself thinking about that, about a tiny person exploring the world without fear because she didn't yet know that things could hurt, could break, could fail. There was something almost enviable about that kind of innocence. A week after the ear infection incident, Elena had approached him hesitantly. Mr. Chun, I have a request, and please feel free to say no. My sister has a job interview next Friday, which means she can't watch Sophia that day. The backup sitter is available, but... She'd paused, choosing her words carefully. Would it be acceptable if I brought Sophia with me? Just for that one day. I promise she won't disrupt your schedule. She naps most of the morning, and I can set up a play area in the laundry room where she won't be in anyone's way. The old Alexander would have refused instantly. His home was his sanctuary, carefully calibrated for productivity and peace. A baby represented chaos incarnate. But the new Alexander, or perhaps the version of himself he'd buried long ago, had surprised them both. She can stay in the guest room, he'd said. It has better light than the laundry room. And there's more space. Elena's face had transformed with relief and gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Chen. I promise. I know, he'd interrupted gently. You'll be professional. You always are. That Friday, Sophia had arrived in a car seat, surrounded by what seemed like an impossible amount of equipment for such a small person. Diaper bag, portable crib, toys, bottles, changes of clothes. Elena had clearly prepared for every conceivable scenario. Alexander had been in a video conference when they'd arrived, but he'd found himself distracted by the soft sounds filtering through his home office door. Not crying or screaming, just the gentle murmur of Elena's voice and occasional babbling responses that he assumed came from Sophia. During a break in meetings, He'd ventured out to find Elena in the kitchen preparing bottles while Sophia sat in a high chair that had materialized from somewhere, gumming a teething toy and watching her mother with rapt attention. This was Alexander's first real look at Sophia when she was healthy and happy. She was remarkably beautiful, all dark curls and enormous brown eyes, with her mother's warm skin tone and an expression of intense concentration as she examined her toy. She was wearing tiny jeans and a white shirt with a cartoon avocado on it that said Guac Star. "Hello, Sophia," Alexander had said, more to himself than to her. But Sophia had heard. Her head had turned toward him with surprising speed, and those big eyes had fixed on his face with laser focus. For a long moment, they'd simply stared at each other, a tiny human and a man who'd built his life avoiding exactly this kind of connection. Then Sophia had smiled at him, a gummy, drooly, completely unself-conscious smile of pure delight, as if he were the most interesting thing she'd seen all day. Alexander had felt something in his chest do a strange flutter. "She likes you," Elena had said, sounding surprised. "She's usually shy around strangers, especially men." "I'm not doing anything," Alexander had replied, but he'd moved closer despite himself. Sophia had tracked his movement, her smile widening. Then she'd done something that made both adults freeze. She'd reached out her small arms toward him in an unmistakable request to be picked up. "Oh, sweetie, no," Elena had said quickly, moving to intercept. "Mr. Chen doesn't want to hold you. He's working." But Alexander had found his hands moving of their own accord. "It's fine." "Are you sure? She's been eating banana, so she might be sticky." "It's fine," Alexander had repeated, and then Sophia was in his arms, solid and warm and heavier than he'd expected, studying his face with that same intense concentration she'd applied to her teething toy. He'd held babies before, technically, at obligatory family gatherings, being forced to pose for photos with nieces and nephews he barely knew. But he'd never actually held one like this, with no one pressuring him, no camera pointed at them, no escape plan in mind. It was just him and this small person who was now reaching up to pat his face with banana-sticky hands. "Sophia, gentle," Elena had murmured, but Alexander had shaken his head. "She's fine." And she was. Sophia had touched his face with surprising gentleness, tracing his features like she was memorizing them. Then she leaned forward and pressed her face against his chest in what might have been a hug or might have been just exhaustion, and Alexander had felt his arms tighten around her instinctively, protectively. Something ancient and primal had stirred in him, some drive he'd convinced himself he didn't possess. The need to protect, to shelter, to keep this fragile little life safe from everything that could hurt it. Elena had watched this interaction with visible emotion. "She really does like you. She doesn't do that with anyone except me and my sister." Alexander had stroked Sophia's curls awkwardly, unsure of what he was supposed to do now. "She's not terrible." Elena had laughed. "High praise from you, I imagine." They'd stood there for a moment, Alexander holding Sophia while she dozed against his shoulder, Elena watching them both with an expression he couldn't quite read. The moment felt significant somehow, like a door opening onto a room he'd never known existed in the architecture of his life. Eventually, Sophia had needed to be fed and changed, and Alexander had returned to his office. But he'd found himself unable to concentrate on work. His mind kept drifting back to the weight of Sophia in his arms, the trust implicit in the way she'd leaned against him, the strange protectiveness he'd felt. That afternoon, between conference calls, he'd gone down to the guest room to check on them. Elena had been folding laundry while Sophia played on a blanket, surrounded by soft toys. Alexander had sat down on the floor, something he'd never done in his own home, and had watched Sophia demonstrate her developmental milestones, rolling over, sitting up, reaching for objects. "She'll be crawling soon," Elena had told him. "Maybe even walking before her first birthday. She's determined." Like her mother, Alexander had observed. Elena had smiled at that, and they'd fallen into easy conversation while Sophia provided entertainment with her explorations. Alexander had found himself laughing, actually laughing, when Sophia had gotten tangled in a blanket and had emerged looking completely offended by the universe's betrayal. When Elena and Sophia had left that evening, Alexander's penthouse had felt oppressively quiet. He'd sat in his living room, still able to see the impression in the carpet where Sophia's blanket had been, and had realized with something close to panic that he'd enjoyed their presence. He'd enjoyed it. This was dangerous territory. Alexander had built his entire adult life on emotional distance and carefully controlled variables. Babies were the opposite of controlled variables. They were chaos agents, disrupting every system they encountered. And yet, Section 4. The word that changed everything, 1,200 words. Over the following weeks, Sophia's presence in Alexander's life became increasingly frequent. What had started as a one-time emergency had evolved into a regular arrangement. Elena's sister was working full-time now, and the backup sitter had proven unreliable, so 2 or 3 times a week, Sophia would arrive at the penthouse with her mother. Alexander told himself he tolerated this arrangement because Elena was an exceptional housekeeper and finding her equal would be nearly impossible. The truth, which he wasn't quite ready to examine, was that he'd started looking forward to those days when Sophia would be there. He'd rearranged his schedule to accommodate more work-from-home time. He'd had James purchase a proper high chair and a collection of age-appropriate toys. For convenience, he'd explained curtly when Elena had tried to thank him. He'd even converted a corner of the guest room into a proper nursery space, complete with a crib, changing table, and a rocking chair he'd found himself using when Sophia was fussy and Elena needed both hands to work. "You're getting attached," his sister Michelle had observed during a rare family dinner. "You talk about this baby more than you talk about your company." "I do not," Alexander had protested. "I merely mentioned that she's learning to pull herself up on furniture. It's a significant developmental milestone." Michelle had given him a look that said she saw right through him. "Alex, 2 months ago you referred to my kids as small chaos generators. Now you're tracking infant development milestones. What happened?" He hadn't known how to answer that. What had happened? Somehow, this tiny person had slipped through his defenses without him noticing. Sophia had no agenda, no manipulation, no awareness of his wealth or status. When she smiled at him, it was because she was happy to see him. When she reached for him, it was because she trusted him. There was a purity to it that Alexander had never experienced in his adult relationships. And Elena, he'd come to appreciate Elena's strength, her quiet resilience, the way she'd built a life for herself and her daughter against significant odds. She reminded him of his younger self, fighting to prove his worth in a world that had dismissed him. He'd given Elena a substantial raise, which she tried to refuse until he'd pointed out that he'd essentially doubled her responsibilities. He'd started ordering lunch for 2 on the days Sophia was there, insisting that Elena needed to eat properly. He'd even bought Sophia a birthday present. Though her first birthday was still months away, he'd seen a handcrafted wooden toy set and thought she'd like it. The attachment Michelle had noticed was undeniable, though Alexander still struggled to name it. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. It started as a normal day, or what had become normal in Alexander's reconfigured life. Elena arrived at 7 with Sophia, who'd recently mastered the art of pulling herself up and was obsessed with practicing this new skill on every available surface. Alexander had been in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports, when he'd heard Elena's voice from the kitchen. "Sophia, no, that's not for pulling. Come here, baby girl." There'd been a pause, and then a crash, not loud enough to indicate serious disaster, but definitely the sound of something hitting the floor. Alexander had been out of his office and into the kitchen before he'd consciously decided to move. He'd found Elena cleaning up a broken coffee mug while Sophia sat on the floor, looking startled but unhurt. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Chun," Elena had said immediately. That was one of your good mugs. I'll replace it. She pulled on the dish towel and brought it down. I should have been watching more carefully. Is she hurt? Alexander had asked, crouching down near Sophia. No, thank God. It fell on the other side of the island. Sophia had looked at Alexander with her enormous eyes, her bottom lip trembling as she processed whether this situation warranted crying. Alexander had reached out instinctively, and she'd crawled into his arms. Yes, crawled. When had she learned that? Seeking comfort. You're okay, he'd murmured, checking her over carefully. Just a loud noise. You're safe. Sophia had clung to him, her small hands gripping his shirt, and Alexander had felt that now familiar surge of protectiveness. He'd walked her around the kitchen, swaying slightly, while Elena finished cleaning up the broken ceramic. I'll deduct the cost from my paycheck, Elena had said quietly. Don't be ridiculous. It's a mug. It was part of a set. Hand-thrown ceramic from Japan. It's still just a mug. Alexander had looked at her seriously. Sophia matters more than dishes. Always. Something had shifted in Elena's expression, surprise mixed with another emotion he couldn't identify. That's very kind of you. They'd settled into the day's routine. Alexander had returned to his office with Sophia, setting her up with toys on a blanket in the corner while he worked, another adjustment that would have been unthinkable months ago, but now felt natural. She was good company, babbling to herself and occasionally bringing him toys for his approval. Around mid-morning, Alexander had been on a video call with his CFO when Sophia had pulled herself up on the side of his desk, a new achievement that made him absurdly proud, though he'd kept his face professionally neutral for the camera. Sophia had stood there, wobbling slightly, one hand gripping the desk edge while the other reached toward him. She'd been doing this thing lately, where she tried to make sounds that approximated words, though nothing distinct had emerged yet. But this time, looking directly at Alexander with an expression of absolute determination, Sophia had opened her mouth and produced a sound that made his heart stop. Dada. It was clear, unmistakable, her first real word, and she'd been looking right at him when she'd said it. Sophia, no, sweetie. Elena's voice had come from the doorway, horrified. She must have heard from the kitchen. He's not. But Sophia, pleased with this new sound, had said it again, louder this time. Dada. Alexander had completely forgotten about the video call. His CFO's voice had been saying something about revenue projections, but the words meant nothing. The entire world had narrowed to this tiny person who just called him. Mr. Chen? Elena had rushed in, her face flushed with embarrassment. I'm so sorry. She doesn't understand. I'll take her. But when Elena had tried to pick Sophia up, the baby had tightened her grip on Alexander's desk and said it again, Dada, reaching her arms toward him with absolute certainty. And Alexander, this man who'd spent 32 years building walls around his heart, had felt those walls crumble to dust. He'd ended the video call abruptly. He could deal with his CFO's confusion later, and had reached for Sophia, lifting her into his arms. She'd immediately snuggled against his chest, patting his face with her small hand and repeating her new favorite word. Dada. Dada. I'm so sorry, Elena had been saying, wringing her hands. She sees you more than any other man in her life, so I think she's confused about what that word means. I'll work on correcting her. Don't. Elena had frozen. What? Alexander had looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who'd fought so hard to give her daughter a good life, who'd been doing it all alone, who'd never asked him for anything beyond fair wages for fair work. And he'd looked at Sophia, who'd trusted him enough to make him the subject of her first word, who reached for him when she was scared, who lit up when she saw him. Don't correct her, Alexander repeated, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. He was still holding Sophia, who had laid her head on his shoulder with the complete trust of a child who knew she was safe. Elena, I need to talk to you. Can you sit down? Elena had lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, her expression wary and confused. "Mr. Chun, I promise this won't affect my work. I'll make sure she understands." "I don't want you to make her understand," Alexander interrupted. He took a breath, trying to organize thoughts that felt like they'd been reorganizing themselves for weeks without his permission. "For the past 2 months, I've been lying to myself, telling myself that I was just being a decent employer, that I was tolerating Sophia's presence, that none of this meant anything." "I don't understand," Elena whispered. "I've spent my entire adult life convinced that I didn't want children, that I wasn't capable of being a father. My own father was cold and distant, and I inherited that from him. Or so I thought." He looked down at Sophia, who was now drowsing against his chest, her small hand clutching his shirt. "But somewhere along the way, this little girl cracked something open in me. When she called me Dada just now, I didn't feel trapped or panicked. I felt complete." Elena's eyes had filled with tears. "Mr. Chen." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formalities, don't you?" "Alexander," she said his name carefully, like she was testing how it felt. "I don't know what you're saying." He set Sophia carefully in her playpen when Dada appeared in his office and turned to face Elena directly. "I'm saying that I've been watching you raise Sophia alone, and it breaks my heart. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with a 9-month-old who isn't biologically mine, but feels like she could be. I'm saying that when she called me Dada, it felt right." He paused, gathering courage. "And I'm saying that somewhere in all of this, I've also fallen in love with you." Elena's hand had flown to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can't mean that. You barely know us. You're my employer. This is unconventional," Alexander finished. "Unexpected. Probably inadvisable from a professional standpoint. But it's also the most real thing I've felt in my entire life." He moved closer to her, careful not to crowd her. "I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I know your life is complicated, and you came here just looking for employment, not a relationship. But I can't pretend anymore that Sophia is just your daughter that I tolerate. And I can't pretend that when you walk out that door every evening, I don't wish she were staying." Elena had been crying openly now. "I'm a 28-year-old single mother with no family and minimal prospects. You're a billionaire who could have anyone. This doesn't make sense." "None of the best things in life make sense," Alexander said. 3 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing here, in love with a woman I technically employ and her baby daughter, I would have thought they were insane. But here we are." He risked reaching out to brush a tear from her cheek. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Elena. You're raising an incredible little girl. You've never asked me for anything you haven't earned, and you've somehow made me believe I could be the kind of man who deserves to be part of your family." "What are you asking?" Elena's voice was barely audible. "I'm asking if you let me try. Let me be in Sophia's life, and yours, as more than just an employer. Let me take you both to dinner, to the park, to the children's museum Sophia would probably love. Let me prove that I'm serious about this, that I'm not going to disappear when things get hard." He smiled slightly. "I know babies are complicated. I know toddlers are harder. I know that relationships are work and that families are messy and that I have a lot to learn about all of it. But I want to learn. With you. If you'll have me." Elena had stood up, closing the distance between them, and for a moment, she just looked at him, searching his face for something. "I'm scared," she finally admitted. "Sophia's already attached to you. If this doesn't work out, if you change your mind, it won't just be my heart that breaks. It'll be hers too." "Then I'd better not change my mind," Alexander said simply. "Elena, I don't make commitments lightly. In business or in life. If I'm promising you I'm in this, I'm in this. All the way." "What about your family? Your friends? What will people say when they find out you're with your housekeeper?" "My sister will be thrilled. She's been lecturing me about my emotional unavailability for years. As for everyone else," Alexander shrugged. "I built a multi-billion-dollar company from nothing. I learned a long time ago not to care about what people think when I know I'm making the right choice. Elena had laughed through her tears. This is insane. Completely, Alexander agreed. But is it a yes? Instead of answering, Elena had stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as Alexander's arms came around her. It was his first kiss in over 2 years, and it felt like coming home to a place he'd never known he was looking for. They were interrupted by an indignant sound from the playpen. Sophia had woken up and was pulling herself to standing, clearly displeased at being left out of whatever was happening. Both adults had broken apart, laughing, and Alexander had scooped Sophia up, holding her between them. "What do you think, little one? Should I stick around?" Sophia had grinned at him and said it again. "Dada." "I think that's a yes," Elena had murmured, leaning against Alexander's shoulder while Sophia played with his tie. That night, after Elena had initially planned to leave as usual, Alexander had convinced her to stay for dinner, takeout from the Italian place, eaten at the kitchen island while Sophia sat in her high chair, making a spectacular mess of mashed sweet potatoes and finding the whole experience hilarious. Watching Elena wipe Sophia's face while Sophia giggled and tried to dodge the washcloth, Alexander had felt something he'd never experienced before: contentment. Not the satisfaction of closing a deal or the rush of a successful product launch. Just the simple, profound contentment of being exactly where he belonged, with exactly the people he belonged with. "I have a question," Elena had said later, after they'd gotten Sophia cleaned up and she was drowsing in Alexander's arms. "When did you know that this was what you wanted?" Alexander had thought about it, tracing Sophia's soft curls with his finger. "I think maybe from that first day when she was sick and I saw how much you loved her. How you'd do anything for her. It planted something in me, this idea that maybe that kind of love was real, that maybe I was capable of it too." He'd looked at Elena. "But I knew for certain the day she smiled at me for the first time. When she reached for me like I mattered to her. In that moment, I stopped being the man who didn't do kids and became the man who'd do anything to be worthy of that trust." "You are worthy," Elena had whispered. "You were always worthy. You just needed someone to show you." 3 months later, Alexander had moved Elena and Sophia into the penthouse permanently, not as his housekeeper, but as his family. He'd set up a trust fund for Sophia, ensured Elena had complete financial independence regardless of their relationship status, and had started the lengthy process of legal adoption paperwork. His business associates had been shocked. His family had been thrilled. The media had brief field day with the Billionaire and the Maid, angled before losing interest when they realized it was just a genuine love story with no scandal attached. On Sophia's first birthday, Alexander had thrown her a party that had been far too extravagant for a 1-year-old, but had delighted her nonetheless. Surrounded by balloons and cake and more toys than any child needed, Sophia had taken her first independent steps, straight into Alexander's arms. And as he'd caught her, lifting her up while she shrieked with delight, and everyone applauded, Alexander had caught Elena's eye across the room. She'd been crying happy tears, and he'd felt his own eyes sting. This little girl who'd called him Dada when she'd barely understood what the word meant had been right all along. He was her father, not because of biology or legal documents, but because of choice. Because every day, he chose to show up for her, to love her, to be the kind of father he'd never had but had always needed. And every day, Sophia chose him right back. 2 years later, when Alexander and Elena got married in a small ceremony with Sophia as the flower girl, proudly walking down the aisle while holding both their hands, Alexander had stood at the altar and marveled at the strange journey that had brought him here. From the man who'd built walls around his heart to the man who'd torn them down for a 9-month-old's first word. "What are you thinking?" Elena had whispered as they'd waited for the ceremony to begin. Alexander had looked at Sophia, now almost 3, who was carefully carrying her basket of flower petals with enormous concentration. Then he'd looked at Elena, radiant in her simple white dress, her hand resting on the barely visible swell of her belly. Their son, due in 4 months. "I'm thinking," he'd said, "that I spent so many years convinced I knew exactly what I wanted from life. And I was completely wrong about all of it." He'd squeezed her hand. "I'm thinking that the best thing I ever did was answer the door that morning when you showed up looking for a job." "Second best thing," Elena had corrected, smiling. "Second best. The best thing you did was let yourself love us back." She'd been right, of course. Because Alexander had learned that love wasn't something you planned or controlled or built like a business. It was something that happened when you stopped defending yourself long enough to let it in. When a 9-month-old looked at you and decided you were worth trusting. When her mother showed you what strength really looked like. When you finally understood that the walls you'd built to protect yourself had really just been keeping you alone. That night, as Alexander had held his sleeping daughter, because Sophia would always be his daughter, no matter what any DNA test might say, and felt Elena's hand in his, he thought about that first word Sophia had spoken. Dada. She'd called him that before he'd earned it, before he'd known what it meant, before he'd been ready to accept it. She'd looked at him with absolute certainty and given him a title he'd been terrified to claim. And in doing so, she'd given him everything.